The newly released materials confirm what fragments of earlier disclosures had suggested. Epstein wasn't merely a wealthy man with questionable personal conduct. He was an architect of networks, a facilitator of introductions, a broker of access, and he continued to perform these functions even as law enforcement scrutiny intensified around him. To understand what these documents reveal, we need to examine not just who communicated with Epstein, but how those communications functioned, what they accomplished, and what they tell us about the vulnerabilities in elite networks that someone like Epstein could exploit. Jeffrey Epstein's trajectory through American elite circles began in the financial sector, but his role evolved into something far more difficult to categorize. By the time the period covered in these latest documents begins, roughly 2012 through 2019, Epstein had already been convicted in 2008 on charges related to soliciting prostitution from a minor. That conviction, secured through a controversial plea agreement, resulted in a sentence that allowed him significant freedom. Jeffrey Epstein's trajectory through American elite circles began in the financial sector, but his role evolved into something far more difficult to categorize. By the time the period covered in these latest documents begins, roughly 2012 through 2019, Epstein had already been convicted in 2008 on charges related to soliciting prostitution from a minor. That conviction, secured through a controversial plea agreement, resulted in a sentence that allowed him significant freedom. Yet this criminal record did not sever his connections. Instead, what the new materials demonstrate is that Epstein continued to position himself as a connector, an advisor, and a host. His value proposition to powerful individuals appears to have rested on several pillars: access to his substantial resources, including properties in multiple countries and private air travel, his willingness to play the role of sounding board and informal advisor, and his apparent ability to facilitate meetings and introductions across sectors and borders. The period from 2012 to 2019 was one in which global politics was undergoing significant realignment. Populist movements were gaining strength in Europe and the United States. The technology sector was consolidating power at an unprecedented rate. Traditional diplomatic channels were being supplemented and sometimes superseded by informal networks. It was in this environment that Epstein appears to have operated with remarkable freedom. Understanding his methods requires looking beyond individual relationships to the structural features that enabled them. How does someone maintain influence after criminal conviction? How do elite networks insulate themselves from reputational risk while preserving access to individuals who provide utility? These are not simple questions, and the documents don't provide simple answers, but they do provide data points. Among the most extensive revelations in the new release are thousands of text messages and emails between Epstein and Steve Bannon, the political strategist who served as chief executive of Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign and later as White House chief strategist before departing in 2017. The communications span primarily 2018 and 2019, continuing right up until weeks before Epstein's death. The volume and nature of these exchanges suggest a relationship that went beyond occasional contact. The two men discussed television shows and news events. They shared views on political figures and strategic calculations. They coordinated travel and accommodations. Epstein offered Bannon use of properties in Paris and Palm Beach. He arranged flights and joked about serving as Bannon's personal travel coordinator. But the substance of their exchanges reveals something more consequential than social familiarity. The communications show the two men collaborating on what might be described as an international political influence campaign, with particular focus on Europe. They discussed efforts to shape governing coalitions in European nations. They coordinated strategies for increasing pressure on China through tariff policy. They explored business opportunities in Middle Eastern markets. Bannon, during this period, was actively working to build networks among nationalist and populist movements across Europe. He had launched an organization aimed at providing coordination and support to such movements ahead of European Parliament elections. The documents suggest Epstein was providing both logistical support and strategic advice for these efforts, leveraging his own European contacts to facilitate meetings between Bannon and government ministers, former heads of state, and political operatives. The exchanges also reveal a transactional intimacy. The two men shared jokes, sometimes crude ones. They gossiped about Washington politics and the ongoing special counsel investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election. They made disparaging comments about political figures, including the president Bannon had served. In one instance, Epstein jokingly suggested Trump should be called a re-grifter rather than someone who regifts. Bannon referred to Trump using ironic titles and questioned his stamina. Epstein also appears to have provided Bannon with media training and strategic communications advice. At one point, the two were working together on a documentary project, with Bannon offering counsel on everything from how Epstein should manage his public image to how long he should maintain his facial hair. As media scrutiny of Epstein intensified in early 2019, Bannon continued to provide guidance on managing press inquiries. The question these communications raise is not primarily about whether laws were broken. There's no indication in the released materials that Bannon engaged in any criminal conduct related to Epstein. The question is about judgment and gatekeeping. How does someone with Epstein's history continue to operate as a significant player in international political strategy? What does it tell us about the ecosystem of political consulting and influence operations that such a partnership could flourish? One possible answer is that elite networks, particularly in the informal spaces where political strategy is conceived, operate with different risk calculations than public-facing institutions. Reputational concerns that would disqualify someone from formal roles in government or public-facing organizations don't necessarily exclude them from behind-the-scenes advisory functions. Utility can override stigma when interactions happen in private. The communications between Epstein and Elon Musk present a different dynamic entirely. Unlike the extensive back and forth with Bannon, the Epstein-Musk exchanges from 2012 to 2014 appear to document a series of unsuccessful attempts by Epstein to establish a closer relationship with the technology entrepreneur. The pattern is consistent. Epstein extends invitations, suggests meetings, offers access to properties and social events. Musk responds politely but non-committally, citing scheduling conflicts and logistical complications. There's no evidence in the released materials of any in-person meetings actually occurring. What makes these exchanges notable is not what happened, but what they reveal about Epstein's methodology. He attempted to create opportunities for association, offering everything from holiday gatherings at his Caribbean island to dinner parties with cultural figures to tours of his residences. He tried to leverage existing connections, referencing Musk's brother in one message, attempting to coordinate through mutual contacts. The few substantive exchanges that did occur show Epstein attempting to establish common ground. They discuss sleep patterns and productivity. In November 2012, Musk inquired about attending the wildest party on Epstein's island that year. The following month, Musk expressed interest in celebrating after Christmas, but wondered whether the island would be too peaceful. Epstein's response referenced the ratio on the island, an apparent reference to gender demographics, suggesting this might make Musk's then-wife uncomfortable. Musk indicated this wasn't a concern. Despite these warmer exchanges, no meeting appears to have materialized. Epstein invited Musk to St. Thomas for New Year's 2013. Musk cited logistics. Epstein tried to arrange a meeting on the East Coast, mentioning a dinner with Woody Allen as an enticement. Musk had no firm plans. When Musk suggested Epstein visit the SpaceX facility in California, that meeting also didn't happen. What can we conclude from this pattern? It demonstrates that Epstein was actively cultivating relationships with influential figures in the technology sector, just as he was with political operatives and business leaders. It also demonstrates that such cultivation didn't always succeed. The released materials suggest Musk kept Epstein at arm's length, engaging in occasional correspondence, but not progressing to the kind of relationship Epstein appeared to be pursuing. This is worth noting precisely because it shows the limits of Epstein's influence-building efforts. Not every prominent individual he approached became part of his network. Some maintained boundaries. The existence of these boundaries makes the relationships that did develop more significant by contrast. Beyond the specific high-profile names, the documents reveal the geographic and institutional scope of Epstein's network. He maintained regular contact with European political figures, including ambassadors, government ministers, and international organization officials. He facilitated meetings between American political operatives and European leaders. He coordinated travel and introductions across borders. Communications show Epstein arranging meetings for Bannon with European government officials. He corresponded with Slovak politicians about meetings with Russian foreign ministers. He scheduled discussions with the Secretary General of the Council of Europe. These weren't casual social contacts. They were functional relationships that served specific purposes, advancing political agendas, facilitating business opportunities, building coalitions. The mechanisms through which Epstein operated in these contexts appear to have been primarily informal. He wasn't a registered lobbyist or official representative. He was a private individual leveraging personal relationships and resources to create opportunities for others. This informal status may have been an asset rather than a limitation. Without official role or title, he could move between contexts and facilitate connections that might have been complicated through formal diplomatic channels. Consider what this reveals about how international influence actually operates in practice. Alongside the formal apparatus of diplomacy and interstate relations exists a parallel network of private facilitation. Individuals with resources and connections can serve as bridges between governments, political movements, and business interests. They can arrange meetings that official channels might not easily accommodate. They can provide venues and contexts for conversations that participants might prefer to keep informal. Epstein appears to have positioned himself within this parallel network with considerable success. The question is whether this success depended on his personal qualities and skills, or whether the network itself has structural features that allow problematic actors to thrive within it. The evidence suggests the latter. A system that relies heavily on informal facilitation and personal relationships is inherently vulnerable to manipulation by individuals willing to exploit those relationships for their own purposes. Among the most politically sensitive revelations in the new documents are emails showing contact between Epstein and Howard Lutnick, who currently serves as United States Secretary of Commerce. The Communications Center on a December 2012 visit by Lutnick and his family to the U.S. Virgin Islands, during which they apparently met with Epstein at his private island. The details are straightforward. Epstein's aide coordinated by email with Lutnick to arrange a lunch meeting on December 23, 2012. Lutnick was vacationing with his wife and 4 children, along with another couple and their children. The logistics discussed included where to dock their yacht at Epstein's island. The day after the scheduled meeting, an Epstein aide relayed a message from Epstein to Lutnick. "Nice to see you." These communications directly contradict Lutnick's previous public statements about his relationship with Epstein. In interviews conducted before his appointment to the cabinet, Lutnick stated that he ceased contact with Epstein around 2005 after visiting Epstein's New York residence with his wife and observing what he described as inappropriate behavior involving massage services. Lutnick said at that time that he and his wife decided never to be in Epstein's presence again. The 2012 emails demonstrate this account was incomplete at best. Contact continued at least 7 years after the date Lutnick specified and involved not just communication, but an in-person meeting at one of Epstein's properties. When confronted with these documents, Lutnick's response was brief denial, followed by termination of the conversation. The Department of Commerce issued a statement characterizing the interactions as limited and stating that Lutnick has never been accused of wrongdoing, while dismissing questions about the discrepancy as an attempt to distract from the administration's policy achievements. The significance here isn't necessarily what occurred in 2012. There's no allegation of illegal conduct by Lutnick. The significance is the discrepancy between documented fact and prior public representation. This matters for several reasons. First, it raises questions about the thoroughness of vetting processes for senior government officials. Did these communications come to light during Lutnick's confirmation process? If so, how was the contradiction with his public statements addressed? If not, what does that suggest about the scope of background investigations? Second, it illustrates a pattern visible throughout the Epstein documents: the tendency of individuals to minimize or mischaracterize their connections to him when those connections become public. This pattern itself is revealing. It suggests widespread recognition that association with Epstein is problematic, combined with calculation that such associations can be managed through careful presentation rather than full disclosure. Third, it demonstrates the enduring relevance of these historical connections. Epstein died more than 5 years ago, yet the networks he built and the relationships he cultivated continue to have consequences in contemporary governance. People who interacted with him hold positions of significant authority. The nature and extent of those interactions remain subjects of legitimate public interest. Stepping back from individual relationships, what do these documents tell us about how elite networks actually function? Several patterns emerge. First, access is a currency. Epstein's primary offering wasn't capital or expertise in any particular domain. It was the ability to connect people across sectors and geographies. He could arrange a meeting with a European government minister. He could provide a venue for confidential conversations. He could facilitate introductions that might advance business interests or political agendas. This access had value, and people were willing to engage with him to obtain it. Second, reciprocity operates through multiple channels. It's not always transactional in the crude sense of quid pro quo. Someone might accept hospitality, or travel assistance, or an introduction, without explicit expectation of specific reciprocal action. But the accumulation of such interactions creates relationships of mutual obligation that can be activated when needed. Epstein appears to have been skilled at creating these relationships without making them feel overtly transactional. Third, elite networks have mechanisms for insulating participants from reputational risk. One such mechanism is privacy. Most of the interactions documented in these files were not public at the time they occurred. They took place in private residences, on private aircraft, in confidential communications. This privacy allowed participants to benefit from association with Epstein while maintaining public distance. Another mechanism is deniability. When connections do become public, they can be characterized as minimal, casual, purely professional, or undertaken without knowledge of the full scope of Epstein's conduct. The documents reveal how difficult such characterizations are to sustain when communication records are examined, but absent such documentation, they often succeed. A third mechanism is selective enforcement of social and professional standards. The same conduct that would disqualify someone from certain roles or institutions doesn't necessarily prevent them from functioning in other contexts. Epstein couldn't have held public office or been appointed to a university faculty after his 2008 conviction, but he could still host dinners, arrange meetings, and provide strategic advice in informal settings. The standards are different. These mechanisms aren't necessarily designed to protect problematic actors. They evolve to serve legitimate functions in how elite networks operate. Privacy protects confidential business negotiations and diplomatic communications. Deniability allows people to take meetings or explore opportunities without committing to them. Differential standards recognize that formal public roles require higher levels of scrutiny than private associations. But the same mechanisms that serve these legitimate functions also create vulnerabilities. They can be exploited by individuals who understand how to leverage them. Epstein appears to have understood this very well. One of the most troubling aspects of the Epstein story is its timeline. The documents released Friday cover a period when Epstein was already a convicted sex offender. He had pleaded guilty to state charges in Florida in 2008. The nature of those charges was public knowledge. Yet he continued to operate in elite circles with remarkable freedom for more than a decade afterward. Why didn't the conviction itself serve as a more decisive circuit breaker? Several factors appear to have been in play. The 2008 plea agreement was extraordinarily lenient. It allowed Epstein to serve his sentence through a work release program that gave him significant freedom during daytime hours. This minimized the practical impact of the conviction on his ability to maintain relationships and conduct his affairs. The charges to which he pleaded guilty, while serious, were framed in ways that some people may have rationalized. The plea was to state charges of soliciting prostitution from a minor rather than federal charges of sex trafficking. Some individuals in Epstein's network may have chosen to interpret this through a minimizing lens, treating it as misconduct rather than the predatory behavior it represented. There was also what might be called strategic ambiguity about the scope of the allegations against him. The full extent of Epstein's conduct wasn't publicly established until much later. In the period covered by these documents, individuals engaging with him could claim, whether genuinely or as rationalization, that they didn't know the full picture. But these explanations only go so far. The 2008 case received significant media coverage. The Miami Herald's investigative reporting in 2018 brought renewed attention to the allegations and the inadequacy of the plea agreement. Federal prosecutors indicted Epstein again in July 2019 on sex trafficking charges. Throughout this period, the basic facts were available to anyone who cared to look. The continued engagement with Epstein, despite this public record, points to a collective failure of judgment and accountability within elite networks. It suggests that reputational costs that should have been decisive weren't, that social and professional mechanisms that should have excluded Epstein from continued influence didn't function as they should have. This isn't primarily a failure of law enforcement, though questions about the 2008 plea agreement persist. It's a failure of the informal mechanisms through which elite communities regulate themselves. The people who continued to engage with Epstein weren't forced to do so. They made choices. Those choices were enabled by network structures that prioritized access and utility over ethical scrutiny. The Epstein documents raise questions that extend well beyond one individual's conduct. They illuminate features of how power operates in contemporary society that deserve sustained attention. The first is the role of informal networks in decision-making processes that affect public policy and resource allocation. Much of what Epstein facilitated happened outside formal institutional structures. Political strategy sessions, business negotiations, diplomatic communications, these occurred in private settings through personal connections. The public has very limited visibility into these processes, yet they can have significant consequences. This creates what might be called an accountability gap. Democratic institutions have mechanisms for oversight and transparency. Elected officials can be voted out. Government agencies are subject to disclosure requirements and inspector general reviews, but informal networks operate by different rules. They're harder to scrutinize. They're less subject to institutional controls. The second issue is the concentration of influence in the hands of individuals who combine wealth, connections, and willingness to provide access. Epstein wasn't unique in playing this role. There are many people who serve as connectors and facilitators in elite networks. Most of them aren't criminals, but the structural position they occupy, the ability to shape who meets whom, who has access to what opportunities, who gets invited into which conversations, represents a form of power that isn't necessarily accountable to anyone beyond the networks themselves. The third concern is the resilience of these networks in the face of obvious disqualifying information. Epstein's case is extreme, but it illustrates a broader pattern. Individuals who should be excluded from positions of influence often aren't, because the mechanisms that might exclude them are weak or captured or simply not activated. This resilience can enable continued harm and can undermine public confidence in the basic fairness of how opportunity and access are distributed. The Department of Justice's decision to release these materials represents a significant act of transparency. 3 million pages of documents are now part of the public record. Journalists, researchers, and members of the public can examine them, draw connections, and develop fuller understanding of how Epstein operated and who enabled him. But transparency alone doesn't solve the underlying problems these documents reveal. Knowing more about what happened doesn't automatically change the structural features that allowed it to happen. It doesn't reform the informal networks through which elite influence operates. It doesn't create new accountability mechanisms for private facilitation of political and business relationships. Some reforms are possible within existing frameworks. Background check processes for senior government officials could be more rigorous. Disclosure requirements for individuals serving in advisory capacities could be expanded. Laws governing lobbying and foreign agent registration could be updated to capture a broader range of influence activities. But structural changes to informal elite networks are harder to legislate. These networks exist precisely because they're flexible, adaptive, and resistant to regulation. They operate in the spaces between institutions, in private communications and personal relationships. Making them more accountable requires changes in professional norms, social expectations, and individual judgment, changes that can't be mandated by statute. What the Epstein documents can do is inform public understanding of how these systems work. They can provide empirical grounding for discussions about influence, access, and accountability that too often proceed on the basis of speculation or anecdote. They can help citizens make more informed judgments about the leaders and institutions they're asked to trust. More than 5 years after Jeffrey Epstein's death, the documents released this January ensure that the questions surrounding him remain unresolved. Not questions about what he did. The evidence of his crimes is substantial. But questions about how he was able to do it for so long, with such extensive networks of support, despite repeated warning signs. These questions don't have simple answers. They implicate multiple systems, institutions, and individuals. They involve choices made by people across the political spectrum in various countries, operating with different motivations and different levels of knowledge. They reveal patterns of enabling behavior that can't be reduced to individual moral failures, but reflect broader structural features of how elite networks operate. The communications between Epstein and figures like Steve Bannon show the integration of someone with his history into ongoing political and strategic projects. The exchanges with Elon Musk demonstrate both the aggressive cultivation of relationships and the possibility of maintaining boundaries. The documentation of contact with Howard Lutnick illustrates the gap between public narrative and private action. The evidence of Epstein's European network reveals the transnational scope of his operations. Taken together, these materials paint a picture of someone who understood how to exploit the vulnerabilities in elite systems, the value placed on access, the tolerance for ethical ambiguity, the weak enforcement of social and professional boundaries when utility is at stake. The release of these documents is not the end of the Epstein story. It's another chapter, one that provides more information but also generates new questions about the people who enabled him, about the systems that failed to stop him, about the mechanisms of power and influence in societies that claim to value accountability and transparency. These are uncomfortable questions. They don't yield satisfying conclusions, but they're necessary ones, because understanding what went wrong isn't just about historical reckoning. It's about recognizing vulnerabilities in present systems. It's about considering whether the informal networks that shape policy, allocate resources, and determine who gets access to power are structured in ways that serve broader public interests, or whether they primarily serve the interests of those already inside them.